I looked down the street, both directions. It was getting dark, getting cold, and I got in the van and I hit a bunch of corners. I went down this street. I turned my light on. I searched. I called their names. Talked to a gentleman on the street on the other side over there. He didn't see anyone.
So he left at 16:33 and he's back by 16:38.
How fast he's coming back? He's punching it, bro.
Yeah, he's moving.
Look at that.
For people who are thinking that there's some kind of foul play involved, we just spoke to the biological mother. She says she had a conversation with you guys, and that she thinks there's some kind of foul play involved, that she thinks you guys did something.
And that's understandable.
What's your response to that?
That's understandable. I would think the same thing.
Yep.
The community is scared, confused, and angry, and so is the biological mother of both boys.
I don't understand.
Where are they?
Ultimately, the answer to the question of where are the boys will be answered. It's that they're dead. And at the end of the case, I will ask you to return a verdict of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt as to Trezell and Jacqueline for the murders of Orrin and Orson West.
A grand jury indicted the West, the adopted parents of Orrin and Orson, in March 2022. Their attorneys have said the couple had nothing to do with the boys' disappearance. The bodies of Orrin and Orson have not been found.
One of the most highly anticipated trials in Kern County in recent years. A jury was chosen last week for the trial of Trezell and Jacqueline West. The California City couple is charged with murders of their adopted sons, Orrin and Orson, who were reported missing more than 2 years ago. The bodies of the boys have not been found. One of the things that's very interesting, though, the boys are still missing. There are no bodies. Yet these parents are charged with involuntary manslaughter and second-degree murder. How is this possible if there are no bodies?
That's one thing that was asked of District Attorney Cynthia Zimmer when the charges were first announced. And she said she could recall 2 cases off the top of her head where there were no bodies in Kern County, but the DA was able to get secure murder convictions in those cases. So it is possible. It is a lot more difficult, though. Typically, in a murder trial, I think Eric Smith said during jury selection last week, he told potential jurors, 99.9% of jury trials, there's a body. You're going to see autopsy photos. You're going to hear from a pathologist talking about how the person died. In this case, you're not going to have that. So it's going to be interesting to see what evidence the prosecution has pointing to the fact that someone was killed and that the Wests were responsible. They have a lot to prove here regarding that, since the boys have not been found.
Involuntary manslaughter to second-degrry murder. Both. Why both?
Most serious charge is the second-degree murder charge. That carries a penalty of 15 years to life. In that case, that's the example I've heard most often is shooting into a crowded room. It's a reckless disregard for human life. You may not mean to kill somebody, but it's so reckless that you can be charged with murder if someone dies as a result. The involuntary manslaughter is the unintentional killing of someone else. 4 years is the maximum you can face with that. As to why they filed both, I'm not sure. It may be that the evidence doesn't support second degree. They go with the involuntary manslaughter instead. In California, it's 7 years a person is presumed dead if they haven't been heard from. In this case, they filed charges just after about a year and a half, I believe it was. And I think part of that is because the boys are so young. Mm-hmm. They're clearly not traveling anywhere. Right. Either. One thing that Timothy Hennessy, one of the defense attorneys for Trezell West, said is that, one, their clients didn't do it, but also he said the boys may still be alive, just missing. Someone may have taken them. So we'll find out more about what he has to say during his opening statement, too.
Because that is what the West said when they initially reported the boys missing. They said they ran away. They got out of the back fence.
That's correct. The father said he was gathering firewood. It was December 2020. He was outside gathering firewood. The boys were outside playing together. He said he went in briefly to drop off the firewood, came back out, and they were gone.
However, the interesting thing in this case is these were not the West's only children. They have multiple other, both adopted and biological children, and they're expected to be involved in the trial, right?
That's right. The Wests have 2 biological children and 2 other adopted children, and at least some or maybe all of them will be called to testify. I believe the oldest is now 13 and the youngest 6. And during jury selection, the defense attorneys did ask potential jurors. They said, we want you to keep in mind that, yes, there will be children testifying. There's probably going to be some emotional testimony, some tears, right. But don't let that sway you. Just listen to what they say. And also to be cognizant of the fact that sometimes children say things to please adults. kind of suggesting to the jury that they may be wanting to please the investigators, and it may not be exactly what happened. But they just told them basically keep an open mind and examine their testimony as you would anyone else.
The West were a family of 8 with 4 adopted children and 2 biological children. Smith told the jury that the West's primary source of income was the $4,000 total a month made from each child they adopted. Smith said the boys are dead and they didn't die at the same time.
Orson was in California City for about 4 days. At some point, Adrian heard a loud thud in the night. The day prior to hearing the thud, Orson was there. The day after the loud thud, Orson was gone and he hasn't seen him since.
Defense attorney Timothy Hennessy says this is still a missing persons case and that the West want answers as to where their children are, as any parents would.
This was a tragic accident, is what the evidence will show. All right? They don't have an answer for it because it was tragic. But instead, Trezell is here on a murder charge.
Hennessy said there are inconsistencies in the investigation and that evidence will show the couple's innocence.
Cal City out the gate just never thought anyone would take 2 little black boys. That's why the investigation will look the way it did.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Trezell West. This is Jacqueline West. And their 2 sons are missing. Their sons, Orrin and Orson, are missing. We're here because it's easier to charge them than for them to explain why they couldn't find them.
This is the last known photo ever taken of Orrin. Recovered from the cell phones that were seized in this case. This is the last known photo of Orson, taken in the apartment at Lotus Lane, July 25th, 2020. Now, during one of the interviews, and it'll be played for you here, Jacqueline West talks about how she talked to her kids about Orrin and Orson. She said, I told them, pretend they're not here. Just act like they don't live here. Just go do your work. She talked about what she did with Orrin and Orson. I always keep them separated. I keep them separated.
Weird.
I focus mainly on schooling while they're playing. They don't really play together, but they have played together. I just don't know. But that's essentially what happened to Orrin and Orson. They were in that home, but they were kept separate. And then ultimately, sometime in September, they were killed and have not been seen since then. Not only were they not in the van on December 19th, that they hadn't been in the home in California City also.
As testimony and body camera footage was played from the night the boys were reported missing, officers questioned that the boys had left through the backyard as the couple claimed.
Their bodies have never been found. Have never been found. Even with the attempts of the California City Police Department, the Bakersfield Police Department, the FBI.
The prosecution also stating that the West's other children all claimed the boys were gone long before that night, and that neighbors claimed to have never seen one or both of them.
For weeks, that all 4 will be called to testify, including the eldest child, who said he witnessed Orrin turn pale and die one night when the family still lived in Bakersfield before moving to California City.
Officer Brian Hansen testified that he became suspicious shortly after responding to the West home for a report of 2 missing children. This was in December of 2020. Hansen said he checked the backyard where the West said Orrin and Orson had been playing, but saw no footprints made by a child's shoe. This is not a normal situation, Hansen said into his body-worn camera video that was playing in court this morning. These kids didn't just walk away, he said. The biggest revelation in this case so far came from the prosecution yesterday. Prosecutor Eric Smith telling the jury one of West's other children said he witnessed one of the boys die and said the other later disappeared after a thud was heard one night. Although the boys' bodies have not been found, the prosecution has said that evidence, including interviews with the West's other children, indicates the boys were killed in September of 2020, 3 months before the West reported them missing. The West are charged with second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and other offenses and face life terms in prison if convicted.
Trial of Trezell and Jacqueline West, charged with murder and other crimes in the deaths of Orrin 4 and Orson 3. Also known as Classic and Sincere, their adopted sons. Their bodies have not been found. Prosecutor Eric Smith says the boys died about 3 months before the West reported them missing. The defense has argued their clients aren't to blame for the boys' disappearance, saying the children were taken while playing in the West California City backyard. The bailiff is letting the public inside the courtroom now. The jurors will follow in a moment. The jury has entered the courtroom and is taking a seat. Judge Charles R. Brimmer told the jury closing arguments may finish today or tomorrow. Brimmer reminded everyone this is a court of law, not Jerry Springer, and asked everyone to continue to be on good behavior. Prosecutor Eric Smith has begun his closing argument. This case is somewhat different in that no bodies have been found, Smith said. He said these types of cases are prosecuted across the country. It's not unheard of in any way. He quoted case law as saying the fact a murderer successfully disposes of a body doesn't mean they're entitled to an acquittal. The evidence has to show Trezell and Jacqueline West caused the deaths, and if you believe that to be true, you can find them guilty of murder, Smith told the jury. They are wholly and completely dependent on their adoptive parents. But ultimately, those adoptive parents were abusive to them, Smith said. He said the boys are dead. Trezell and Jacqueline West projected a certain image to the parents and relatives, but that's not who they were. They were physically abusive to Orrin and Orson, Smith said. The West adopted for money. They got $1,000 a month for each of their 4 adopted children, Smith said. They abused Orrin and Orson, not their 2 biological children. Their main source of income came from the adopted children, Smith said. They basically warehoused these children. They kept Orrin and Orson separate from the others. Why? Because it was for the money, Smith said. When the adoptive children cried, Jacqueline West would put an arm around their neck and basically cut off their airway to get them to stop, Smith said. Spankings from Trezell were so severe the children bled, he said. The West's eldest child told a social worker the metal on his father's belt would cause the bleeding. Physical abuse is what happened to Orrin, to Orson, because they were crying, because they were not their own children, Smith said. Smith showed 2 photos, which he said are the last known photos of the boys alive. He asked the jury to look at Orson's face. Look at the sadness evident in his look. There were more than 65 witnesses and 120 marked exhibits presented in this case, Smith said. He said there is direct evidence, testimony of the West's eldest child, and circumstantial evidence, which he reminded the jury is not lesser than direct evidence. He said circumstantial evidence can be used to corroborate witness statements. Counts 1 through 3 relate to Orrin. They are second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and child abuse. Counts 4 through 6 relate to Orson. They are conspiracy to commit murder, second-degree murder, and child abuse. The 7th charge, false reporting of an emergency, applies to both boys. Smith told the jury, a person can be guilty as the direct perpetrator or as someone who aids and abets in the crime. If you know of someone's unlawful purpose and you help them, you can be equally culpable, the prosecutor said. Second-degree murder is an unlawful killing and can be either an act or a failure to act with the knowledge of danger and disregard to human life. You don't need to have an intent to kill for second-degree murder. Smith said a parent has a legal duty to care for their child. If they have a legal duty and fail to act, and the child dies, they can be found guilty of murder. In this case, Smith said, Orrin was lying there dying, and the West never called an ambulance or otherwise got him medical aid. With Orson, the West conspired to kill Orson after Orrin's death, Smith said. They came to an agreement to commit murder, he said. They agreed that one of them would intentionally and unlawfully kill, Smith said. There was conspiracy to commit the first-degree murder of Orson West, he said. There was premeditation and deliberation, he said. It's unknown who inflicted the mortal wound to Orson, but it's one of the 2 co-conspirators, Trezell or Jacqueline, Smith said. A charge of involuntary manslaughter is alleged for Orrin only. The jury can consider that or murder for Orrin's death. The West lived in an apartment on Lotus Lane in Bakersfield for many years. They purchased a home in California City on Aspen Way in September 2020. The question, Smith said, is who moved into that home? Were Orrin and Orson there, or were they already dead? Cal City Police were called on December 21st, 2020. Smith said the agency had no experience with a case of that magnitude, so they asked for help. The FBI responded, but there were issues as to who was in charge. The Bakersfield Police Department later got involved. Smith said it has to be noted the foundation of what Cal City Police were investigating came from two liars, Trezell and Jacqueline West. Court is taking a brief recess. A juror has a nosebleed and has left to take care of it. Back in session, the 911 call reporting the boys missing came in at 5:41 p.m. on December 21st, 2020. The investigation began with that call. Cal City officer Brian Hansen arrived, looked at a vacant lot, and other officers searched the home. They drove around the area and found nothing. They found nothing, absolutely nothing, during all of that searching, Smith said, of the helicopter, civilians, and law enforcement that canvassed the area. Police began noticing things the West said weren't adding up. They noticed Trezell said he closed the gate so the dogs wouldn't get out, but somehow the kids got out. The description of the kids' clothing changed. The West's demeanor seemed off. There were no footprints in the dirt where the West said the boys were playing. The West gave inconsistent statements to police, Smith said. Their time frame, given by Jacqueline West, was wrong. Alarm bells were going off with police as they continued to question the couple, Smith said. Smith is going over the different surveillance camera footage from California City that the jury will have access to. None of those videos show children walking. There was testimony regarding 4 separate residences with surveillance footage, Smith said. One video shows Trezell West going in and out of the gate in his backyard. At some point, he's seen walking from the gate area to the house. If the children had been there, that's when they would have walked away from the home. There's no children visible, none whatsoever. There's no adult visible approaching the home, Smith said. Smith said, in that video, there is no sign whatsoever of Orrin and Orson from December 21st. No blood evidence was found, but Smith said that this wasn't a shooting or a stabbing. That's not how you kill children, he said. They would have been choked or drowned, subjected to something that cuts off their airway, blunt force trauma, things like that. Disposing of the bodies would have been as simple as placing them in a garbage bag and throwing them away, Smith said. The boys were small. It wouldn't have been difficult. A diaper found in a trash bag after BPD got involved tested positive for DNA for 2 of the West children, but not Orrin or Orson. Smith is going over mattresses and pillows where the boys' DNA was not found. Orrin's and Orson's DNA was not found in the rooms that they were supposed to be staying in Cal City. The backyard gate was difficult to open, as seen in a video of a Bakersfield detective opening and closing it. The boys wouldn't have been able to open it, Smith said. Trezell and Jacqueline gave conflicting statements as to who closed the gate. Trezell in an interview said 100% he didn't close it. Jacqueline says she didn't close it when questioned. Again, none of their stories are lining up at all, Smith said. Jacqueline said she was wrapping gifts in the living room, but Trezell says she wasn't in there, Smith said. Smith is playing portions of interviews. Jacqueline tells police she went down the street looking for the boys. No, she did not, Smith said. That's an absolute lie. He said the video shows she wasn't there. Phone records show Jacqueline and Trezell spent about 5 minutes talking on the phone with their eldest son, not searching, Smith said. Smith said the West even created fictional characters. Jacqueline West at first says the biological family had no contact with the boys, but months later says an Aunt TT had the kids for a week earlier in 2020. She provides no contact info or TT. A cadaver dog was brought to the home because of what Jacqueline told investigators about 2 dirt mounds. Asked if that's where the boys were buried, she said maybe. Remains weren't found, but the dog did alert to the area Jacqueline pointed out. Smith said death had been in the backyard at some point. Carla Martinez, Jacqueline's sister, never met Orrin or Orson. During video calls, the camera moved around and she couldn't see who was there. She testified she didn't know what the boys looked like, Smith said. Maria Martinez, Jacqueline's mother, said she didn't watch the boys or have much contact with them. She was so disconnected, Smith said. She didn't even know their names. Maria Martinez testified she found it weird that her daughter wouldn't show her grandchildren during the video calls. On the side of Trezell's family, his parents and brother never saw the boys after COVID started. The mistake Trezell and Jacqueline West made is they thought law enforcement had to ask permission before interviewing their children, Smith said. They don't need permission. But ultimately speaking with those children is what changed the course of the investigation, Smith said. The 4 children gave consistent answers as to who lived in Cal City, who was in the van when they were dropped off January 19, 2020 at Trezell's mom's house. Smith is playing clips from the interviews with the children. At the apartment, one of the children says when asked when's the last time he saw Orrin and Orson. This boy says Orrin and Orson are with Jacqueline's mother. Smith says that's consistent with what his brothers have said their parents told them. Again, this is consistent, child after child, Smith said. Because they cry a lot, another child said when asked why Orrin and Orson don't live with them in Cal City. Everything the other children said was consistent, Smith said. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. Court is back in session with prosecutor Eric Smith continuing his closing argument. The West's eldest child told a social worker he saw Orrin die at the apartment in Bakersfield, and his parents told him if he told anyone, he and his brothers would be taken away. Because the eldest child is so credible, the defense paid an expert witness between $35,000 to $42,000 to try to discredit him, Smith said. He knew the right thing, Smith said of the eldest child. The reason he didn't say anything earlier is because of his parents. Smith played a recording in which Jacqueline and Trezell West told the eldest son during a phone call that he didn't have to talk to anybody. They wanted him to stay quiet because they knew the truth would come out, Smith said. Going over the events of December 19, 2020, Smith said Wanda West, Trezell's mother, never saw Orrin or Orson, despite spending time in the van where the boys were supposedly sleeping in the back. The West made multiple stops that day. Surveillance footage never shows Orrin or Orson, Smith said. Smith is going over December 5, 2020, where the West separately went to different locations after their 4 other children had been dropped off at a relative's. Orrin and Orson aren't seen in any of the videos. Where are Orrin and Orson? They're dead, Smith said. Smith is going over the September 2020 timeline, the month in which he says both Orrin and Orson died. Orson is killed the night of September 17, 2020, the attorney said. Wanda West, Trezell's mother, arrives the next day and watched the 4 children. She doesn't see Orrin or Orson. Jacqueline West tells her the boys are with them in a U-Haul they're using to move from Bakersfield to Cal City. Wanda West didn't see Orrin or Orson despite staying at the Cal City home from September 18th through September 20th, 2020, Smith said. Smith said this case is about corroboration. All the circumstantial evidence points to one thing. The boys were never in California City, Smith said. When their kids do things wrong, the West react with violence, Smith said. They spank with a belt until the children bleed. They choke them, he said. Their whole lives are based on money for the 4 kids they adopted, Smith said. After Orrin died, the only way they could get away with it would be to kill Orson, Smith said. They then had 3 months to discard the bodies, get new phones, he said. Trezell and Jacqueline have no moral fiber. They killed 2 kids, Smith said. Trezell and Jacqueline West murdered Orrin and Orson, he said. Smith ended his closing argument by asking the jurors to find the West guilty on all charges. Court will resume at 1:30 p.m. with defense closing arguments. The public and jurors have been let back into the courtroom, and the defense is about to present their closing argument. The defense has placed a number of items, including toys, Christmas stockings, and child car seats on the defense table. Timothy Hennessy, lead counsel for Trezell West, told the jury he's scared of saying one thing that could turn the jury against him. He said he's using notes to give him some sense of control. He said he's scared not only for the West, but for himself, because if he can't show the jury what the prosecution's trying to do, then he's just some idiot with silk around his neck. The birth parents' DNA is on a car seat in the van, Hennessy said. The boys gave conflicting stories, and a car was seen driving away from the area. He said the prosecution's whole theory of what happened doesn't make sense. Hennessy said there are lights seen, possibly a car leaving, on the night of the reported disappearance that the prosecution can't explain. "This man has no moral fiber," Hennessy said as he displayed photos of Trezell holding the children with a smile. He said the prosecution needs more evidence if they're going to make that claim. Hennessy is referring to Cal City's role in the investigation and their failure to document all evidence, and how there is even a jury instruction about how police failed to get surveillance footage from one house. Hennessy has mentioned COVID, George Floyd, and Tiger King in explaining how it was a weird time. "The reality is that 2 little boys went missing. They got took, and that is terrifying," Hennessy said. The attorney told the jury they have to think it's odd that they saw more videos than any of the detectives. Hennessy said he pointed out a car leaving the scene of the West house during his opening statement, and authorities weren't even aware of it. He said that shouldn't happen. Cal City police didn't look into registered sex offenders living in the area, Hennessy said. There should have been more investigation into a tip reporting the boys had been seen in Arlington, Texas, Hennessy said. But those questions have scary answers, he said. "Why are there blinders on?" Hennessy asked. He said it's because they're scared. So they just focused on the West and didn't do more testing, look into other possibilities. Law enforcement didn't do enough, Hennessy said. They were stuck with the decisions made early on when Cal City police didn't take into account that someone took the boys, he said. They were tied to what Cal City officer Hansen did, Hennessy said, adding that Hansen was wrong in his belief the West were responsible. Hansen was ready to arrest the West the night of the reported disappearance, Hennessy said. The officer suggested he was going to arrest Trezell while in his house questioning him, he said. Hennessy noted a realtor who went to the Cal City home testified he was confident he saw at least 5 children. Wanda West, Trezell's mother, was scared too, Hennessy said. She got dates and times wrong, doesn't accurately remember events, he said. Everyone was under the same spell, from investigators to family members, refusing to look into other possibilities, Hennessy said. The other children were given examinations, and there's no evidence that corroborates they were abused, Hennessy said. Race is hard to understand, Hennessy said. Race is hard to talk about. He said it relates to this case. Trezell and Jacqueline are a mixed-race couple. A guy captured on surveillance footage riding a bike to a store was identified by an officer at trial as Trezell West. It wasn't, Hennessy said. It was another black man. Trezell showed up later in a van, he said. Hennessy, who is white, said if his child went missing, police wouldn't be calling him a liar the night of, taking his gun, questioning his account. He said they would have investigated everything first. When they rested their case, you had to have winced a little, thinking, that's all? Hennessy said in reference to the prosecution. He finished his argument, and the court is taking a 15-minute break. Court is back in session, and Alexia Torres-Stallings, lead counsel for Jacqueline West, has begun her closing argument. Torres-Stallings is going over a few jury instructions and said she will show how they apply to her closing. How to evaluate a witness testimony? There are a number of things to consider, including how well could the witness see or hear the event? How reasonable is their testimony in light of the other evidence? What was their behavior like while testifying? Torres-Stallings is referring to Officer Brian Hansen's testimony and said, there are glaring issues in this case that cannot be excused. Other than the testimony of the West's eldest child, everything presented in this case is circumstantial evidence, Torres-Stallings said. She said if 2 reasonable conclusions can be drawn from circumstantial evidence, one pointing to innocence and the other to guilt, then the jury must choose the one pointing to innocence. This isn't a case where there's an overwhelming amount of evidence, Torres-Stallings said. There are no confessions, no forensic evidence, she said. More DNA testing should have been done. Fingerprints should have been collected, Torres-Stallings said. The eldest child's testimony is the heart of the prosecution's case, Torres-Stallings said. It's not that the other children's testimony wasn't important, but the eldest child is what the case against the West was built on, she said. There were issues with how the children were questioned, she said. Torres-Stallings is continuing to go over how the children were questioned. Social worker Sonia Barton was the first person to mention a body in the interview with the eldest child. Until she mentioned it, the boy never said anything about death or a body, Tori Stallings said. Tori Stallings read part of the grand jury testimony where the eldest child said Orrin and Orson were seen a few days before Christmas 2020. She noted defense attorneys aren't present during grand jury testimony and couldn't ask follow-up questions. Tori Stallings said she's not calling the eldest son a liar, but the surrounding circumstances need to be taken into consideration when evaluating his testimony. Law enforcement was supposed to protect the West, not blame them, Tori Stallings said. She said law enforcement didn't take them seriously. She said investigators kept telling Jacqueline West they were taking her kids. That's hard, Tori Stallings said, her voice wavering, especially 4 days before Christmas. Law enforcement told Jacqueline West the chances were slim that a stranger took the kids. But Tori Stallings mentioned the cases of J.C. Dugard and other prominent stranger kidnappings to illustrate it does in fact happen. Tori Stallings is playing a portion of an interview in which a detective tells Jacqueline West everything bad that's going to happen to her if she doesn't tell the truth. As the audio played, Tori Stallings showed a video of the West now empty home and said everything the detective said came true. They've lost their children, family, and friends. But Jacqueline and Trezell West are still together, and they haven't turned on each other, she said. There is nothing in this case that points to the unreasonable conclusion that they did anything, she said. Smith is now giving his rebuttal testimony. Then the case will go to the jury. Smith, during his rebuttal, focused on the eldest child's testimony and how he described seeing Orrin die and how strong that evidence is. He said the boys were adopted by abusive parents who killed them, and it's time for justice. And he asked the jury to find them guilty on all 7 counts. Smith's rebuttal has ended, and the judge is giving the jury some final instructions. The jury was taken to the back to begin deliberating and will resume deliberations at 9 a.m. Wednesday. The judge has adjourned court for the day. They won't be back in session until they receive a note from the jury.